This week in the Regency, we're going to do a roundup of all the carriages that we've been looking at over the last few months so that you can compare them side by side. Our jumping off point is the Morning Post of the 21st of November 1810, so right at the beginning of the Regency. Number 29, Oxford Street, Bushnell and Rawson coachmakers begs leave to return thanks to the nobility and gentry for the very great encouragement experienced at their redarium and manufactory. The redarium, a word I have never encountered before, just literally means coachmaker, from a Latin word meaning coach, which is the only establishment on that basis in the kingdom, where are kept constantly on sale a large assortment of modern, well-built carriages of every description. From their numerous applications, ladies and gentlemen may ensure themselves a ready sale for such carriages as can be warranted to the purchaser. So in posh language, because when one deals with the nobility and gentry, one must speak in posh language. That's saying we make them, but we also sell them secondhand as long as they're in good shape. We can sell them on consignment for you too if you wish to sell your own. So let us look at a large assortment of modern, well-built carriages of every description. And before we do that, I want to give credit where credit is due. The drawings and descriptions we've been using this year for carriages have come from this, a treatise on carriages in 2 volumes by William Felton, coachmaker, number 36, Leather Lane, Holborn. Unfortunately, number 36, Leather Lane, Holborn is a very modern building now, so it's no use going to have a look at it. But William Felton, the first volume of his treatise was very technical about all the kind of nuts and bolts. And then the second volume talks about the specific carriages in some detail, and it's the selling document effectively. So thank you, William Felton. I have learned a great deal from you. I'm going to talk about the carriages in a kind of ascending order from how many horses, how many people can sit in them, and so on, leading from small to large, from open to enclosed. So we're going to start with the gig. This is a chair-backed gig. You can see it's got a higher back than some do, but it's still got that box on the back for your groom, your tiger perhaps, to jump up on. And the difference between a gig and a curricle, they're both 2-wheeled vehicles that seat 2 people. And the difference is that a gig has 1 horse, whereas a gig curricle has 2 horses. You can see here that the back on the chairback gig is higher. It's meant to be more comfortable for longer drives or for people who aren't so interested in speed, because the thing about the curricle is you can see it doesn't even have a box, and it's a crane necked perch there, so that it travels quite lightly on the road, and it's designed for speed. The chairback gig is more the kind of thing your country doctor would have to go around seeing always his patients. From there, that's your basic two-wheeled carriage. And there are lots of various variations on that, huge number of variations on that, pony carts, dog carts, all sorts of things. But basically, you've got 2 people with or without the covering that can come up over their heads to shield them from rain. You'll notice the curricle often doesn't have that. And these, particularly the 2-horse curricle, they're very light, which means that the horses can go for longer, but it also means they're more likely to get into an accident. And so when you look at carriage accidents in terms of how often they turn up in the newspapers, it's the curricle that comes way ahead of everything else in terms of number of accidents. but closely followed um, by the phaeton. Now we've moved here from 2 wheels to 4, and the real giveaway of the phaeton is that the wheels are not the same size. And I often think, I look at this, I think this is where someone thought about the penny farthing, that big wheel and the little wheel. And here we have a 1-horse phaeton. The fact that it's specified as a pony or 1-horse phaeton shows that you can have 2 horses. And typically when people were trying to cut a dash, that's what they had. It would have looked something like this. Again, still quite a light thing. It's not meant for long journeys where you have to be comfortable. This is a getting around town or getting into the village, or going for a display ride in Hyde Park. And we go from that to the really fashionable version, which is the high perch phaeton. And those of us who remember the Grand Sophie, this is what she drove. And what you can see here is that the weight is distributed so that the biggest weight is over the back wheel, because that's the wheel really that's driving things. The front wheel is more about control of which way you're going. And without that weight on the back wheel, this would be a very unsafe carriage indeed. So this was the kind of high point of fashion for someone who wished to cut a dash in society. You had to be a good driver to drive a high perch phaeton, and you had to have really well-matched horses. You couldn't put just any 2 horses together. They had to be exactly the same height, exactly the same stride. People often, for these and for curricles as well, for the top-notch curricles, people often used sibling horses. But when people talk about matched bays, for example, I'm driving my matched bays on my matched greys. Matched refers to them being exactly the same height with exactly the same stride, so that they are moving in unison, a bit like synchronized swimmers. So this is where we get to the top of the I'm driving myself, I'm so cool kind of carriage. Then we have the carriages that have drivers. Now, technically, you could have a driver drive you around in your high perch phaeton, but you would look pretty stupid. You shouldn't be having one of those carriages unless you can drive it. Of course, if you were driving someone, you were going to Hyde Park and you picked up a friend or offered a lady a ride, perhaps, that's fine. But to own the phaeton and not drive it oneself, it's a bit naff. So what do you do if you don't want to drive things yourself? And what if you've got more than 2 people? First of all, if you don't want to drive yourself, but you only have 2 people still, you would move to the landaulet or demi-landau. And I'm going to go straight to the landau so you can see the difference. But note that this carriage is the first that has a driver's seat. Then we have the landau, which also has a driver's seat, but which has 2 seats set what is called vis-a-vis, which is face-to-face, so that the people in the carriage face each other. And the landau, the main difference between the landau and the barouche, which is a very similar body and style of carriage, is that the barouche tends to have only one big hood that comes from the back seat over, kind of 3/4 of the way over, which means you can't enclose a barouche in the way that you can enclose a landau. When you pull those 2 hoods up, they click in together and you have a waterproof carriage. You can't do that to a barouche. And so that's why in a barouche, the higher ranking people sit facing forwards and the lower ranking people sit facing backwards, not only because it's less comfortable to face backwards and you're more likely to feel sick, but also because if it rains, as it so often does in England, the higher ranking people won't get wet. So rank is built into the actual material fabric of life during this period, and it's really interesting looking at how that works. So much for open carriages, except for my possible favourite, the sociable. Like a barouche, it only has a hood at the back. The difference is it's wider and it can fit 6 people. And so this is the biggest carriage. This is the carriage that you would have if you had a big family, possibly 2 of them, given the size of some families in this period. Or your maid would sit under the little parasol and you would sit facing forwards. So the sociable is called that because it was sociable. You could have more people in it than not. So much for the open carriages. Now we're going to the closed carriages. And the smallest of those, but also the fastest, is of course the post-chaise. It's the complicated one to understand in terms of how it goes. It doesn't have a driver. It has postilions who ride, at least one postilion who rides the lead horse. And they are called postboys, no matter how old they are. What you can't see from this image is that there are windows in the door, but there's also windows across the front. And so you get a really nice view. Note there's no driver blocking your view. And so it's a great carriage for traveling because of that, and also because it's very lightly sprung. They were called yellow bounders. Most of them were painted yellow for some reason, particularly the hired ones were all yellow. If you had your own one, you might paint it in your own colours, your livery colours. But they were called yellow bounders because they bounced those on those leather straps connecting to the crane necks. And so you didn't get that thump, thump, thump that you get when you're going over corrugated roads, but you did get bounced quite a lot. And so some people just couldn't travel in them. It made them too travel sick. So from the postchaise, we go to the chariot. So you can see it's very much like a postchaise. Some of them were built with the windows, some were not. And those windows, by the way, could either have sliding shutters or curtains. But the big difference here is that we have a driver's seat, a driver's box, as it's called, the hammer box. And in the posh version, the kind of fashionable version of the chariot, which is the town chariot, we come at last to my favourite thing in the entire investigation of carriages that I've been doing, the hammercloth of livery. I don't know why that amuses me so much. So this is the hammercloth of livery, which is done up in your own colours with lots of lace and stuff, and is incredibly expensive. So chariot and town chariot together still only fit 2 people. You might fit a child in there with you, but it's still quite a small carriage. So what do you do if you have more than 2 people that you wish to accommodate? Well, you go for a plain cloth. You can see that it has a hammercloth, but it's not the hammercloth of livery. It's not as fancy. This is a plain coach. It's your standard 4-person, 4-seating coach. And this is the kind of coach that people would have got from town to town. So you could have your own, but you could also, in the way that you catch the bus, you would catch a coach from, say, Bath to London. And it only seated 4 people. This is the kind of stripped back version. And the thing about stripping it back is that the horses can go for longer because it's nice heavy. It's really very simple. However, if you're in town and you're just driving around town, and town here is any of the big cities, London, Birmingham, Norwich was the second largest city in the early 1700s. But in town, one might doll up, bling the ride, so to speak. And here we definitely have the hammercloth of livery, plus, quite ornate fittings and one's crest on the side. Even the footman has a quite fancy place to stand. And there's tassels waving everywhere. It's great. So your town coach has more stuff on it. And because the horses don't have to go so far. There's also a version of this plain coach, which is stronger and heavier, and for travelling. And for travelling, that means long distances. But particularly, there was a version of this that was made specifically for the roads in Europe, because the roads in Europe were so much worse than the toll roads which had been instituted in Britain. So we can see real differences from country to country in how one travelled. That's my quick zip through the main types of carriages, open and closed, which a person might commission from a bredarium. What's been clear to me as I have done this research and looked at the images, the paintings from the period about each one of these, what's been clear is how tightly connected to rank this is and social status. If one keeps a coach, if one keeps a carriage, it's a very specific level of societal wealth and standing. And also how many horses there were. So most of these coaches, this plain coach, you could pull with 2 horses for a while, but you'd have to have shorter stages, or you could go with 4. Anybody who's got 4 horses to a coach is doing very well for themselves. So when we look at which carriage is appropriate for which character, so this is why I'm interested, obviously, like who has a coach, who has a gig, who has a curricle, who has a phaeton, who has a high perch phaeton. These things shift depending on gender, although interestingly, women absolutely were driving 4 horses in hand in curricles and phaetons. We have ample evidence of that. So there's not that, women could be whips, as they were known. People who were good drivers were known as whips, and women definitely could be, but only rich women, because keeping horses and keeping carriages, not only was it expensive in itself, very expensive indeed, particularly if you lived in town, but it was also heavily taxed. So the more carriages you had, the higher the tax you paid. And so whether or not you could keep horses in your stable rather than on your farm, as Mr. Bennett did, whether you could have 1 horse or 2 horses, a gig or a curricle, whether you had 2 horses or 4 horses in a phaeton or a curricle, whether you have a plain coach or a town coach, a plain chariot or a town chariot, a post-chaise of your own or a hired one. Each of these was a very specific level in society, and people were judging them judging others for it in exactly the same way that people look at luxury cars now. And there's a difference between the types of luxury cars. There was a difference in the types of carriages and how they were kitted out. Not only on the outside, but on the inside as well, whether one had linen seat coverings or silk seat coverings, for example, because the silk had to be redone every year or so as it got worn, So there were all these gradations of social class depending on every element of your transportation. And that's a fascinating thing to have a look at when we consider the Regency. So that's this week in the Regency. I'm Elizabeth Laban. I would love you to subscribe and let me know if there's anything about coaches or any other part of this research that you would like me to do more of or show you more of, because I'm always up for more research. I'll see you next week in the Regency.